Hello, students. Welcome to week 7 of Understanding Christian Marriage. We are drawing near to the end of the course. In fact, today will be the last lecture time for the class. We do have one more week, which means that all of your presentations need to be turned into me by next week so that I can view them and so that I can share them with the rest of the class so that you all can watch each other's presentation. So please do that. And if you have any difficulties creating a YouTube channel to send that, please let me know. Or if you have another method you prefer where you can send a link of some sort that I can turn around and send to others, that would be advisable as well. And please let me know again if that's going to be an issue you need. You will also have an exam next week. I will be sending out a review for that, and that should get you on path to know how to study and how to prepare for the exam. As you all are aware, we did not have the midterm, and therefore the percentage for the final goes up, and I want to make sure you're prepared for that so you will have that review. Tonight, we are going to be, or today, whenever you watch this, be going through the final 2 chapters of Willard Harley's book, and then I'll be pulling from other sources as well. As far as the Willard Harley book, that actually won't take very long for the lecture this evening because we want to dig into some other material as well, as I said. Chapter 13 is a chapter that talks about the surviving of an affair. As a pastor, I talk to people at all stages of life, whether they be children or teenagers or adults, whether they be single adults or married adults or adults that have been through divorce or adults that have been widowed. And these are stages of life that are all very significant, some very painful. I have had the opportunity to talk with couples who have had the heartbreak of a marriage that falls apart because of bad choices on one side or the other or both. And I've also been able to talk to those couples, and some of them come back together and have a reuniting. They practice forgiveness and healing, and really chapter 13 of the Harley book goes into that, of how there is such thing as surviving an affair. And I think that's a very important chapter to read so that you can be prepared to have those type of conversations as you move through ministry and through life. As you see in the chapter, he does talk about times when, at least in his assessment, there are times when it's unwise to restore the relationship. He mentions abuse, for example, and those are times where serious counsel needs to be sought, and it needs to be sought in the realm of faith and contextualized in the sense of being counseled by a person of Christian faith for Christians who are seeking the wisdom of God in such opportunities or challenges. And then chapter 14, he does a review of the book, talks about how we can be irresistible and what he means by that in the sense of we practice meeting the needs, the top needs of our spouse, and that makes us, in a sense, in his verbiage, irresistible. One of the things that he says and draws attention to are the appendices at the back of the book. Appendices 1 or Appendix 1 is one that really does a good recap of the needs, desires for each area that he's covered. And then in Appendix B, there is a wonderful tool, a test that you can take yourself so that you can discover, if you're not really sure yet, where your deepest needs are. What of the examples that he gave throughout the chapter, the way in which you find attraction, both emotionally, physically, relationally, spiritually, with your spouse, that Appendix B will help in that. So that would be a good activity for you to do if you're married as a couple, if you're dating as you prepare to be a married couple, or even as a single adult who is not sure of your plans in the future, it's good to take so you're aware of your own needs, because many of the needs can be met in a non-romantic way, uh, just in companionship and friendship with a person of the same gender. This friendship that is significant. But again, primarily he's talking about Christian marriages, but I think it behooves everyone to at least take a look at Appendix B. With that, I will close the book literally and move on to some other things for this evening. But I hope you've enjoyed the book. As I stated from the beginning of the class, I did find the book helpful, and therefore that's why I chose it for this class. But I do understand that it is somewhat limited in perspective, in the sense that he does spend a lot of time talking about the issue of adultery. And I don't want to get lost in that. I don't want the rest of the information to get lost in that, because fortunately, adultery is not a reality in most marriages. There are trials in all marriages, but adultery doesn't have to be one of those, and obviously shouldn't be one of those. But the book has a wider audience, if you will, when we look outside that particular issue and think of it preventative medicine versus going and attacking in a healthy way and a virus in a marriage and bringing this out. So hope you gleaned from it and been able to find some other sources as well. What I'd like to do is to spend a little time drawing from a book by Dennis and Barbara Rainey called Staying Close, and then also drawing a little bit from the Balswick book, Jack and Judith Balswick, a model for marriage, as I've mentioned nearly every week. The theme that we're going to spend some time talking about this evening, or today, again, whenever you're watching this, is conflict. All marriages are going to have conflict. And some of those conflicts are as simple as, what side of the bed do you sleep on? Or what chair do you sit at the table? Or what is the right toothpaste to buy? Or who does what's chores? And some of the conflict becomes a much bigger deal when it comes to finances, or where we should move, or how many children we should have, or if we should have children at all, or what is our future look like as far as retirement, and what happens when we go through difficult times, what happens if our challenges come that we're not ready to face, at least we believe. These conflicts arise, and the book's going to, while Harley addressed them a little bit, I like the way that Dennis and Barbara Rainey address it in the book called Staying Close. And in this, they talk about 5 tips for confrontation, 5 tips for confrontation. Some of you may just be confrontation avoiders altogether. I tend to be this way. I do not like confrontation whatsoever. So it takes more courage from people like myself, maybe you as well, to prepare for confrontation. Other people actually enjoy confrontation. Maybe it's just in a more formal area of debate, or just a argumentative person. What they are saying is that regardless of your love or liking or lack thereof, debate of conflict is a reality. In fact, sometimes it's necessary, because conflict does not equal fight. Conflict can mean simply a disagreement, a different perspective. And what that turns into really depends on the two people or peoples involved in that conflict. And so what they do is provide some tips that Dennis and Barbara do with confrontation that we will face and we need to handle well. Understanding Christian Marriage is the class. Christian, based upon the title of Jesus the Christ, the English word from the Greek word Christos, which is the Greek word from the Hebrew word. We spell out Messiah, this anointed one. And therefore we have this marriage based upon the anointed one, this marriage based upon Christ. And so good marriages are based upon the person of Christ and the personality of Christ and the actions of Christ. And we see that Christ, Jesus the Christ, was not afraid of conflict. He always handled it perfectly. And he knew indeed conflict was necessary, particularly when he dealt with those who, in a pursuit of righteousness, became self righteous, and people who were grabbing for power and oppressing the weak and oppressing the poor and the widow and the orphan, etc. He came into conflict and he did it perfectly. We're not going to do it perfectly. So this is where the Rainey's tips are helpful. The first tip is to check your motivation. Question: will what you say help or hurt? Will bringing this up cause healing, wholeness, and oneness, or further isolation? So what's your motivation? Are you trying to restore the relationship? Are you trying to sharpen the relationship? Are you trying to help the relationship grow deeper? What is your motivation? If your motivation, check yourself on this one. If your motivation is just to be right and prove the other person wrong, that conflict is unnecessary. Indeed, it is unwise. That confrontation does not need to take place. We think of people who like to stir the pot. People say people like to make trouble. This is unadvised, and this is not, should not be a part of a Christian marriage, any marriage for that matter. But Christian marriage needs to be held to a higher standard. Christians are called to live like Christ. Even though Christ wasn't married, he said an example of it was to be the perfect husband, to be the perfect person of love. So first, check your motivation. Second, check your attitude. Check your attitude. Loving confrontation says, I care about you, I respect you, and I want you to respect me. I want to know how you feel. So what's my attitude? Am I going to go in with an attitude of selfishness, or am I going to go in with an attitude of humility and listen and see where I might be wrong? So if my motivation is right, if I'm going in for the right motivation, that's going to help my attitude to be right. Because if my motivation is to make things better, then my attitude is one of going in and saying, I'm positive, I am thankful for the fact that I have this opportunity to have healthy conflict that needs to address an issue. We also think of the third tip is to check the circumstances. They say this includes timing, location, and setting. They go on. The time for Barbara to confront me is not just as I walk in from a hard day's work, and the same is true for her. So they learned as a couple that timing is very significant. Now, this is true with romance. It's also true with conflict. It's often been said, you don't argue when you're hungry. Don't argue when you're tired. Make sure that people are ready mentally and are thinking more clearly. And if we're hungry, if we're tired, we can be snippy or just standoffish or too distracted, literally by a rumbling stomach, or just the thought of, wow, I'm hungry and I can't pay attention, or I've had a bad day and I'm angry. You don't want to pass that forward on to your spouse or your loved one. So make sure you check the time. Location. I always recommend that if couples are having some type of confrontation, and not be in the bedroom. Bedroom needs to be a place of safety and romance and comfort. And maybe the kitchen table or the couch is a better place to sit down together and have a conversation that may be a little more weighty than a place that should be known as restful and a place of romance. So arguing in the bedroom is not a good idea. Timing. If you're trying to go to bed and it's late and one person's already very sleepy, not a great time. Not a good time to say, oh, I've got one more thing. We go to bed. Now, if that one more thing is I love you, or one more thing is I forgot to tell you, and it's something positive, that's good. But if it's, oh, I got one more thing, this bothered me today about what you did, then that's not advisory. It goes on to say in that same section under the third tip is never criticize, make fun of, or argue with your mate in public. If you had this book, which you certainly can get, Staying Close by Dennis and Barbara Rainey, I would tell you to fold down page 249, highlight, underline, circle, never criticize, make fun of, or argue with your mate in public. I would say this is also true in front of your children, because it makes people feel uncomfortable. You know exactly what that's like. Maybe you remember this from your childhood, or you remember it as your children looked at you wondering why you're arguing with your spouse so publicly, or it's been in a work function or a church gathering and you start arguing, everybody doesn't know what to do. You need to be careful with this. Now, can you lovingly poke fun, check the barometer of your relationship, but be careful with it. Fourth tip is to check to see what other pressures may be present. What other pressures may be pregnant? Pressures may be present. Big difference there. Our kids are all out of the house now. We're empty nesters, as I've mentioned before. But when we travel in Alaska, we travel a lot, basically close to nowhere, except maybe Canada, and even that from here is several hours of driving. So we're close to nothing. We have to fly everywhere we go, unless you're driving the Alcan. I've driven this 3,000 and 4,000 miles, depending on destination, one way. All that to say, we travel a lot, and most of the time we travel is by plane. And airports can be places of great stress. And particularly when our children were small, to take a family of 5 with 3 small children, a very, very stressful thing. And I'm not saying this is a mature stance, not my prouder moments, but my family learned that basically from the time that we were either dropped off at the curb or we parked the vehicle at the airport for a short trip and walked into the airport, checked the bags, got our boarding passes, made it through TSA. Once Dad made it through TSA, and the 5 of us all made it through TSA, then you could start talking to me. What's that mean? Well, it's not a great reflection on me, but it's an honest story to say what our family realized is that I was not at my best as we're trying to get from car to airplane, or at least through security. Once you got past TSA, I was fine. But with the bags and the stress and back in the day, the strollers and the diaper bags and the long lines and all of these things, I'd be in a very stressed moment. So my wife, the wonderful woman that she is, knew that if there's something that needed to be talked about that was not even conflict, but just something of substance, something that wasn't just on the basis of how's the weather or what do you think about what I'm wearing, whatever these silly things might be. It's not a good time to be asking questions much deeper than that. And so everybody just waited till we got through TSA, and then we had a normal family conversations. Check to see what other pressures may be present. For me, the pressure of travel was pretty heavy. As I got older, we got to laugh about it, how Dad used to be. And I'm thankful that while we live in the largest state in the United States, we have one of the smallest populations in the United States. So air travel is not as stressful up here, particularly when it's just 2 of us or 1 of us traveling versus 5 of us. The 5th tip is this: be sure you're ready to take it as well as dish it out. Be sure you're ready to take it as well as dish it out. Now, why is that important? It's one thing to say, I want to have some conversation with you to help address an issue. And it's another thing to say, I want to have a conversation with you and I really want to listen to what you have to say. I really want to get your perspective on this. Those are galaxies far, far away, if you will. If I'm just going to share my piece, if I'm just going to talk about what I desire to change, then I need not start the conversation. But if I'm willing to listen carefully, to receive constructive criticism back, then that's a good conversation to have. And keep that in mind in your relationships. In the Balswick book that I've mentioned several times, and I told you I'd be in this evening, this is in chapter 10 of the book. If you do get this book, you will find some of the information I'm going to be talking about in chapter 10. And in chapter 10, they talk about conflict as necessary. Here's a sentence from the chapter. It says, in fact, if a couple claims never to have conflicts, we can make one of several assumptions. And here's 4. One, they haven't been married very long. Two, they don't talk to each other very much. Three, one spouse has all the power and the other has none. And four, they are in denial. So conflict is definitely necessary. Goes on to say ways that people avoid conflict. And this is on page 120. They all start with D, and they are denial, which is pretending there's no problem when there is one. Displacement, expressing anger to the wrong person. In other words, you're upset with your spouse, so you move that anger towards your child. Disengagement, separating yourself from your anger. It may sound like it's good, but in other words, it's pretend. Anger not managed well is a bad thing, but we can't pretend it's not there. And disqualification, discounting anger by minimizing it. Oh, it's not that big of a deal, when inside it is bigger. One of the clear examples of this is found all the way back in the Genesis account in the book thus called. In Genesis chapter 4, we are one chapter after, obviously, chapter 3. And chapter 3 is the chapter where we see sin enter the world in the choice of Adam and Eve as they fall for the lie that the serpent brings to them, the half truth, which is a lie. So what we find is that they continue on as a couple because God, while judging them justly, protects them, places them in a new place outside of Eden, on the earth, and protects them and clothes them. And then they are a couple that is engaged in getting to know the earth, getting to know the world in which they live. As a part of that, they're getting to know each other, and this is sexually. And so as they do this, as they've been instructed back before sin, remember, it's not a sinful thing if we handle it well. They have two boys, Cain and Abel. And some of you are very familiar with the story where Cain kills Abel. How the story is often told is you have two brothers offer a sacrifice, Cain and Abel. Cain's sacrifice, God looks at it and is not pleased with it for whatever reason. The Bible isn't very specific on why, just God wasn't. Abel's, God was. This wonderful sacrifice of an animal. And God looked upon it with great pleasure. The story goes, in the way it's often told, we just jump forward and Cain has the rock, kills his son Abel, or his brother Abel. And we have this beginning, a continuation of a family conflict that began between husband and wife and now is spread to the family. All that is accurate, but it's incomplete because there's a wonderful warning from God in the midst of the time period between God showing favor for Abel's offering and not for Cain's, and the murder and sin of Cain. There is a story in between, an event in between that can really help us analyze our commitment. So in Genesis chapter 4, in chapter 4, verse 5, it says, "But on Cain and his offering, he, God, did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast." So we know he's angry. We know, if we know the story, he's going to kill his brother. But here's what we miss sometimes. Verse 6, "Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door, desires to have you, but you must rule over it.'" Here in just 2 verses time, we see a great opportunity for Cain to deal with conflict in a wonderful way. His conflict right here is with God. It's not Abel's fault that God did not take pleasure in Cain's offering. And God is sovereign and holy, had a good reason not to take pleasure in Cain's offering. But Cain is not going to take his anger out in a sense of, I'm jealous of my brother's success. But God says, hold on, Cain, pay attention. Sin is right there crouching at your door. Why are you angry? And then he gives him this out. If you will do this, it's going to go well. But if you don't, it's not going to go well, because it's going to rule over you. Anger is going to rule over you. I want you to notice in verse 7, it says, if you do what is right, and the right is to just accept the fact that God did not accept his offering as pleasing, and continue on. Learn how to do a better offering. But he says, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Will you not be accepted? His offering wasn't accepted, but God's saying you will still be accepted if you will do what is right. This is a wonderful illustration right there early in the scriptures, 4 chapters in, to say if we're going to deal with conflict well, we need to make wise decisions as we do it and not be led by emotion, particularly the emotion of anger. And God gave Cain a good time to cool off. So I think a 6th tip, and to add to their 5, going back to the Rainey's words, is to say cool off. Spend some time to cool off before you deal with it. In addition to the Rainey's rules, we find rules that are very similar that are listed in the Baldwick's book, but they come from George Bach and Peter Wyden's book, The Intimate Enemy: How to Fight Fair in Love and Marriage. This is all the way back. This book, not this book, but the book they're quoting, is all the way back from 1969. And notice the words, The Intimate Enemy: How to Fight Fair in Love and Marriage. Now, I do not like that title. My wife and I never use the word fight. We have been married 30 years, as I've said, and we certainly have disagreed and certainly have had different perspectives and have had challenges, decisions to make. But we don't fight, because we hear the word fight and we think of a very negative activity or a very negative response to something. They're using that word because it's catchy, or it was catchy even in 1969. We also use the word enemy. My wife is not my enemy. She's my bride, my lover, my friend, not my enemy. But again, what they're using this title to say, play on words, intimate enemy, my closest enemy, which is really should be your closest friend. They say in this context, after we use all these catchy words to grab your attention, ignore the title, but pay attention to these rules. I think they're very important to go along with the Rainey's more modern version of the 5 tips, to which I added 1, which was to cool off. And we'll see some of that theme here in these rules that belong to Bach and Wyden. Number 1 issue only. First rule they give out of 12 is 1 issue only. In the conflict, don't say, oh, and one more thing. Deal with the issue. Don't build issue upon issue. 2, choose the time and place. You've already addressed that. 3, be prepared. In other words, know the rules. You think of even war, all-out war between nations, between tribes. There's usually some sort of rule. Think of the peace accords of the UN or the big decision makers globally. And they'll say, for example, no chemical warfare, no terrorism. Our country says that we're not going to torture people to get information. There are rules. Now, war is still war. People still die. People still get injured. Land is injured, etc. But be prepared. Know the rules so you don't bend the rules in the midst of it. So, for example, if the rules are we're going to be kind to one another, we're going to speak respectfully, you need to know that and go in with that knowledge. Number 4, the past is past. So if something's already dealt with, don't bring it up. 1 Corinthians 13, I've mentioned this so many times. Love keeps no record of wrong. So if you've forgiven it, don't bring it back up. So for example, if you're having a conflict over someone's lack of communication skills, and you remember an instance from 5 years ago where there was a glaring example of that, but you've already forgiven that. In that conversation, when you're trying to address the issue of, I wish you'd talk to me more, or I wish you'd listen better to me, these kind of conversations, you don't bring up, well, like I said 5 years ago, the past is the past. Number five, no surprise punches. They say emotion laden areas are off limits. So don't guilt trip people. Don't try to make your spouse. Uh, sometimes in arguments, we feel with other people, wow, good, I got him on that one. You don't want to do that with your spouse. Number six, no hitting below the belt. Now, that should be obviously no hitting, but they mean that figuratively, no hitting below the belt. There are some issues that just need to be dealt with very sensitively, and you don't want to push on someone's pain when you're in the middle of a conversation. Also, don't dismiss, don't be flippant. So your spouse comes to you and has a concern, and you may say, that's not really a big deal at all. Don't say that. And then listen, think it through. Why do they see it as a bigger deal than I do? Number eight, no why questions allowed. Blame or accusation often lies behind the why questions. Maybe a little overstated, but the why, I wouldn't avoid that word altogether. In fact, it can be a very helpful word, but in their sense, it's this selfish use of the word why. You need to use it positively. You've heard the question phrase, how does that make you feel? That's better than why do you feel that way? Because then they don't have to defend themselves. They explain how they feel. And there is a big difference here. So that's kind of what they're getting at. Do a dyad versus triad. Keep it between the two of you. If you have kids, never put a kid in between you physically or relationally. Don't get dads, don't get your son on your side. Moms, don't get your daughters on your side. And don't say your dad always frustrates me or your mom always frustrates me. Keep it between adults, keep it between spouses. And don't do this with your friends. There's all sorts of, whether it be a sitcom or movies or just locker room, grocery stores, wherever it may be, there is this idea that husbands could sit around and do this bashing, not physically, of course, but this bashing of wives and how annoying their wives are, or whatever they would say that's foolish. And then the wives can sit around talking and say, well, my husband does this, and my husband does this. You need to be the standout in that. You need to be the person that says, I love my husband. I love my wife. Now, inside, you know that's still true, but you have some other issues that are there that you say, well, I'm dealing with this, but you don't say that out loud. It's none of their business. And so it's this, now triad, give me more than three, just change the word there, but you get the point. Dyad, two people deal with it, not three people. Don't try to get somebody on your side. Don't kind of outnumber your spouse. The only difference to that would be in a professional counseling setting, that sometimes you need a third person or another couple to come in and help you, but that person can't take your side. That person has to help both of you. So you're still a dyad with a third person in there, but not taking sides. Number 10 out of 12, don't ridicule. No put downs, no name calling. It's rude. 11th, veto power. There needs to be a signal technical error when rules are broken. That's what they call it, the signal technical error. Maybe it's a timeout. Maybe it's hold on a minute. I think we agreed to be kinder. Whatever it is, in the heat of the moment where things can get going and emotion can take over, there needs to be maybe it's a physical sign, pull of the ear, a hand that says, please wait a minute. Some sign that says, I'm uncomfortable with this. I was having a conversation a while back with somebody in a meeting, and their tone was changing because they're adamant about it, and the tone became somewhat of a tone of almost trick question, in the sense of, if I ask these questions the right way, that no matter how your answer comes about, it's going to make you wrong and them right. And I simply, in this conversation, said, I don't like the tenor of the question. And the message was taken, and it was a wonderful experience. We did well through that. Similar thing can happen with your spouse and saying, I do want to continue to listen, or I do want to continue to share, or I do want to continue this conversation. But can we take a break and back up and remember what the agreed upon rules are here? And then 12, break at the end of each round, short breaks for bodily rest. Even in the best conflict, that your body can literally tense, and your temperature can literally rise, and you need to deal with that and be healthy with it. So this kind of goes back to that earlier rule that only one issue at a time. Well, think about it in time settings, that even in the one issue, maybe there needs to be a break. And hopefully your ongoing conflict's not going to be that long where you need breaks, or you need water breaks, timeouts, bathroom breaks, whatever. But there may be times, and it needs to be dealt with in a healthy manner. I think it is very worth having the time to be a person who is willing to have these conversations, especially when they need to be had. They need to be dealt with. I'll say again, as I said a moment ago, there are times when there does need to be another person brought in, and that is in a professional counseling setting, a pastoral counsel setting, a trusted Christian couple who will not take sides, but will listen. But the majority of times of disagreement will be able to be handled by a couple that is honest with one another, that's loving with one another. It's not simple, but it's doable. That's the way God wired us, is to be able to deal with conflict in a healthy way. So in understanding Christian marriage, right away we understand that adjective, that we have this Christian marriage, not just marriage, but Christian marriage. And Christians should be able to have the tools based upon the word of God to say, okay, I have the tool set. I have the wisdom of the Lord. Tells me how to deal with this, and never get distracted from that. Along those lines, I want to make sure you are clear on the fact that while some, for lack of better terms, secular tools are helpful, there's a lot of great sociological studies, psychological studies, studies in anthropology, study in emotional health, emotional support, all sorts of great tools that don't have a stamp of faith on them. There's also a lot of those same areas that have great Christians who do those works in science and research, et cetera. And all of those can be useful to some degree. But we need to understand that if we're trying to get deep into what we're supposed to do in this situation, when the Christian gospel-centered answer differs from example, then the Christian example for the Christian marriage is always the weightier one, the more important one, the right one. So, for example, if a couple has a conflict about participation in faith, participation in church, the scripture makes it clear that Christians need to be a part of a faith community. So the conflict could be, in a healthy manner, in prayerful manner, which church are we a part of? Not, are we going to be in a church? Or when couples have children, the conflict shouldn't be, will we take the kids to church, but what church are we going to go as a family? These type of things, there's a clear answer to that. And the world just might have a different answer in that area. So always listen to God's word on this. There are times also that worldly counsel will say there are some things that are just too hurtful to forgive. And there are some things that is too deeply hurting that they're just unforgivable. And the Bible makes no distinction. And so what the Bible says is we are to forgive. Now, to forgive does not mean you let the sin continue. Doesn't mean that relationships are always restored, but it means that forgiveness is always the answer. That forgiveness is always the thing to which we must pursue. And that's something you will not hear that across the board. Some people, even of not faith-based background, may not call it forgiveness, but they understand of the letting yourself free of this. And the Christian standpoint, forgiveness, yes, sets you free from that burden of unforgiveness, but it also sets the other person free, not holding them against you, not holding that against them. And so that's something to pray about, work through as you deal with your own challenges in your marriage, and kind of going back to the past of the past, the things you forgive, you leave in the past. The way in which they continue, the Baldwins do, continue to talk about the styles. They have 5 styles of conflict. And there is the winner, the resolver, the yielder, and the withdrawer. And the compromiser is there in the middle. So you have winner in the top left corner, resolver in the top right corner, yielder in the bottom right corner, withdrawer in the bottom left corner, and right there in the middle of the X, if you will, is the compromiser. So the winner, that's a person who's going to go into conflict and will not be pleased unless they win. The withdrawer is just simply not going to have the conflict, avoid it at all costs. The yielder is natural response is to accommodate one's spouse without expressing personal desires. So not that they'll run or withdraw from it. They just will say, well, whatever you want. Now, sometimes that can sound like a Christian way to do things, but that's not a Christian way to do things. It's saying, well, I'm just going to push down my feelings. The yielding is not healthy for the yielder. Maybe in the short term, but long term, this thing's built up. And again, the winner is just going to try to win regardless. It says on this page, the most important challenge for a winner is to stop talking and listen. Strong convictions bring a lot of energy, and winners need to tone down so spouses will talk. And then you have the resolver, represents the resolver will stay with the conflict until a couple comes to an ideal resolution. The compromiser in the center, one who gives as well as gets through negotiation. The natural inclination of a compromiser is to care about what the spouse wants as well as to clearly express personal wants. Cooperation in finding a mutual satisfactory solution is the goal. It is assumed that one will give in order to get, but other times this balances out. Negotiation is practical. As I've mentioned before, one of the things that I really enjoy about the material called Grace Marriage is this is getting close to that in the sense that there's this give and take, but at Grace there's even more give, not in the sense of the anything you want, but in the sense of I'm going to practice grace with you just as my God practices grace with me. What he goes on to do in this book is to talk about some ways in which people are in seasons of marriage. I'm just going to read through their seasons, and I want you to think about what season you may be in. And here they are. Honeymoon marriage, season of marriage. First child, season of marriage. No children, season of marriage. Young children, season of marriage. Teenage children, season of marriage. Divorce/remarriage, season of marriage. And then remarriage, season of marriage. Reconstituted family, season of marriage. Launching stage, season of marriage. Emerging adulthood, season of marriage. post-launching stage season of marriage, retirement season of marriage, and sunset season of marriage. So again, those are honeymoon, first child, no children, young children, teenage children, divorce, remarriage, kind of flows together, remarriage by itself, reconstituted family, launching stage, the kids are leaving home, emerging adulthood, post-launching stage, retirement, sunset years. And then it goes through all of these stressors, such as differences in roles in the honeymoon period and displacement, the first child. Now we're trying to figure out how to share our love with a third person who's our child. How do we spend time with a third person in a healthy way and not neglect our spouse? Or no children, is that by choice or infertility? Young children, now busy. Life is exploding with activity, which is fun, but also challenging, etc. And you can think about the different challenges that come in different phases of life. One of the interesting ones that comes down next to the bottom, right from the bottom there, before sunset years, is retirement. And one of the challenges or stressors is being always together, which may sound amazing to many people, but there's always a joke. So if I better get a second job because I'll drive my spouse crazy, that is a reality for people that need to deal with it. One of the things that is a challenge is for us to identify where we are with reality. In other words, we can understand, do I have children? Do I not have children? But in what stages do we find ourselves in marriage, and how do we address those? So one thing, if you're married, that would help is for you to talk about stages of marriage. Some of them I mentioned, and think about what are those stressors, and how can we as a couple, as husband and wife, address those in a healthy manner. On chapter 14 of this book, the Boswick book still, there are 10 disciplines that enhance marriage spirituality. Now, I want to go through these slowly, write them down, because these are great ways in which couples can unite in a healthy marriage to have a strong spiritual connection. Before I get to these 10 disciplines, I want to say that God's design for marriage is one man, one woman in marriage, and that one man and one woman have a shared faith in Jesus. That is God's design for marriage through the lens of Christ. I know that's not the reality for everyone. It may not be the reality for some of you. God's design, however, is one man, one woman in a committed relationship, and they share a faith. And that is essential in order to be able to have the deepest spiritual relationship that a couple can have. And by spiritual, I don't mean any kind of new ageist idea. I mean, in touch with the Spirit of Christ, in touch with the truth of God, feeling that connection with spouse and with God. When I did my daughter and son-in-law's wedding a little over 3 years ago, I guess closer to 4 now, I did their wedding, and they had 3 ropes that you tie into a knot. Some of you have done this or seen this, and it's that image of scripture about the 3-cord strand, that it's stronger, representing husband and wife and God. This is the goal that's to be accomplished through a discipline such as these. So again, write these down. I want you to know them. They are going to be helpful, not only for information, but for you and your relationship, particularly your relationship with your spouse. These come from the Boswick book, but they actually originate from a book called Marriage Spirituality by Paul Stevens. Marriage Spirituality by Paul Stevens. And Stevens identifies 10 disciplines that enhance marriage spirituality. The first one is prayer, praying together, spending time talking to God and listening to God together. First is prayer. The second is conversation. This is talking to one another, particularly about your faith journey, about your connection with God. One of the things my wife and I like to do is to talk about what scripture we read each day and say, what'd you read? What did you learn from it? What did you get out of it? This is good conversation, but also just good conversation to continue enhancing a relationship. We also have worship. Now, in this case, worship is a broad term, but here they believe just that devotion to God, that going to church together, that when you're not in church, listening to worship songs together, being a part of worship together. Another is retreat. Now, this can be, we need personal retreats sometimes, but this is together, just two getting alone, practicing solitude. And this is intentionality, not just getting away to escape, but spending time away from normalcy and then making times away normal and ordinary and part of the schedule. This is very important for couples with little kids. It's true for everybody, but sometimes when people have little kids, they do not develop a trust system for people that can watch their kids. And therefore the excuse is we can never go out because we have nobody to take care of the kids. Well, find somebody within your church community, within a professional childcare institution that is trusted and licensed, and spend some time with each other. And there you can have prayer and you can have the worship, you can have the conversation, retreat. So prayer, conversation, worship, retreat is study. This is studying the word of God together and studying the word separately and then sharing it. You can also do this in a life group, as we call it in our church, or Sunday school class, whatever you might call your groups. Hope you're a part of one, and you can learn in a larger group, and then as a couple talk about it. We have prayer, we have conversation, we have worship, we have retreat, we have study, we have also service. One of the great spiritual bonding opportunities is by serving together, going and serving at a food kitchen, and going and helping paint a house for Habitat for Humanity, going on a mission trip together, going and doing some project for a nonprofit, going and mowing a disabled person's home, yard, whatever, just finding time together where you can serve together. And then sexual fasting. This is coming from Paul's words, where he's actually talking about the value of sex. And he says that husband and wife, in order to keep the devil from getting a foothold, should please each other sexually. This is in the book of Corinthians. He makes one exception. He says, come together except for perhaps for a time of prayer. Now, the old joke is, how long is that prayer? Particularly somebody interested in sex with their spouse is wondering, well, how long is that prayer? A few minutes, a few days, a few weeks? The Bible doesn't say, but the point is there needs to be time, particularly in a sexually active marriage, which all of them should be, as physical ability allows, that there needs to be time where people are reminded that sexual pleasure is not the highest pleasure. That while physically it may feel like that the deepest, most beautiful connection is with our God and then with our spouse. And so they recommend, based upon Paul's words, this sexual fasting. The old joke of how long, leave that between you and your spouse. Obedience, simply another practice, a discipline of spiritual maturity is obedience. Are we obeying God? When God says, be generous, are we generous? When God says, I want you to volunteer, when you hear that some way from the word or from a preacher or from a good friend, are you obedient to that? Confession. One person calls this the surgery of forgiveness. personal confession to God, but also to each other. Someone says, you weren't listening to me. You can say, okay, I confess. I'm honest, I was not. Please forgive me. And now let me listen. Or I said I completed that task you asked me to do, and I didn't do that. That's confession. The responsibility of the person who's in the wrong is to confess. The responsibility of the person who's being confessed to is to forgive. Really build spiritual unity. And then mutual submission. We found that in Ephesians. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So let me give you those 10 again. One is prayer. One is conversation. One is worship. One is retreat. One is study. Service. Sexual fasting. Obedience. Confession. And finally, mutual submission. Those are areas in which people find themselves, and they only find themselves there if they intentionally put themselves there. So couples, individuals within couples, as you want to grow spiritually together, as individuals growing even stronger together, those are some practices that you can participate in and make a part of your lives. My favorite verse, Romans chapter 12, verse 1. It is in the Message version from the Apostle Paul to the Christians in Rome. Here's what I want you to do. Take your everyday, ordinary life. You're sleeping, you're eating, you're going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. To take that and to apply it directly to this class. The challenge in that text, which is a beautiful challenge, the calling in that text, is you can hear Paul saying to husbands and wives, here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take every day of your marriage. You're going to work during the day separately, still thinking of one another. You're going to bed together for rest and for romance together. You're dealing with conflict together. You're parenting together. You're empty nest together. You're forgiving one another together, lives, and lay them before God as an offering. And when you do that, scripturally speaking, God looks upon that as an Abel type offering versus a Cain type offering. And too many people are taking marriages and giving Cain type offerings to God. They're just barely committing to marriage, or they're just saying, well, I'll just put myself in this marriage and through this marriage and endure it and even complain about it and pretend that I'm doing something to honor God. What we need to do is take the greatest human relationship that we can have and use it as an act of worship before our holy God. So that is the end of our lecture time. The lecture time, you have not completed the class, as I said to begin with. You still have a little bit. Hopefully, you're well underway. So make sure those assignments are turned in. You study for the test, look on Blackboard. I'll give you that review sheet, and then get those presentations turned in, and you'll be good to go. And I trust that this has been a helpful class, and hope that you will apply it not only to your own lives, but to others that you encounter through ministry or through just the regular part of your lives in whatever realms God calls you into vocationally and relationally. God bless you, and thank you for being a part of understanding Christian marriage.